Welcome to Real World Perspectives on Poverty Solutions. I'm Trevor Bechtel, facilitator of this series with Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan and instructor of the course that accompanies this lecture series. Over these next 5 weeks, we will introduce key issues regarding the causes and consequences of poverty in this virtual space, featuring experts in policy and practice from around the nation. We are an audience of students enrolled in our course, community members, academics, policymakers, and interested people from Southeast Michigan and beyond. And we are really excited about today's presentation from Carolyn Barnes about her new book, State of Empowerment, in partnership with the Program on Practical Policy Engagement. But before we dig into this conversation, I want to remind our viewers that we want to hear from you. You can submit questions and comments in the comment box to the right on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag #UMPovertySolutions. We look forward to a meaningful conversation, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We welcome an open and respectful dialogue, and we want to let folks know that we will be responsive to any inappropriate content. I invite you to check out our resources, tune in for additional events, and find other ways to connect with other poverty research at our website, poverty.umich.edu. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Mara Cecilia Ostfeld, Assistant Research Scientist and Faculty Director of Communications at Poverty Solutions, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you everyone who is joining us this afternoon. It is my great honor to be introducing Dr. Carolyn Barnes today. Dr. Carolyn Barnes is an assistant professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. She earned her PhD in both political science and public policy from our very own University of Michigan, where she worked as an affiliate of the National Poverty Center, now Poverty Solutions, conducting research on the effects of nonprofit community-based service provision on parenting practices and the psychosocial well-being of families and children. Her research agenda broadly explores the social and political implications of social policy on low-income populations in the areas of child care policy, family services, and supports for young children. Her work has been published in a number of top journals, including the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, as well as the Journal of Youth and Adolescence. It's also been funded by institutions that include the William T. Grant Foundation and the Weiner Family Foundation. So today we have the great honor of hearing Dr. Barnes share some key takeaways from her 2020 book, State of Empowerment, Low-Income Families and the New Welfare State. Welcome, Dr. Barnes, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mara, for that great introduction. I really appreciate that. I'm honored to be here. I am a Ford School alum, Go Blue, and I'm so excited to be sharing some of the work that I developed from my dissertation project while I was at Michigan. And it's now a book-length project that came out last February. So to give you some background on some of the research questions that I'm interested in, I like to study folks' interactions with the welfare state and the consequences of those interactions. And the reason why I'm so interested in this topic is because I grew up on a lot of means-tested public assistance programs and understood how disempowering those programs could be for families. So one of the motivating factors for wanting to study people's direct experiences with welfare were, my family's own direct experiences with welfare. So I arrive at Michigan and I meet great mentors in the political science department and the Ford School. Shout out to Nancy Burns and Sandra Danziger if they're on if they're watching. And I asked this question, building on some of the previous research that other policy scholars have done about the quality of people's experiences with the welfare state. So I wanted to explore these programs, and I wanted to make sense of why public assistance programs tend to have these negative consequences for families. Why are they difficult to access? Why do they leave folks feeling alienated and politically excluded and marginalized? So I started this project as a grad student. The name of the book is called State of Empowerment, Low-Income Families in the New Welfare State, in part because I came across a surprising set of findings that suggest that public policies that are targeting low-income families don't necessarily have to be politically alienating. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about some of the lessons that I've learned from studying the case of subsidized school-age childcare, or otherwise known as after-school care, and some of the key shifts in social policy that may create a state of empowerment or empowering experiences with the welfare state. Next slide. So the motivation from a political science perspective and from the political participation literature comes from the notion that there's this political inequality in the democratic process. So low-income, marginalized individuals are underrepresented in every political activity. And this is important because this means that the preferences of the marginalized or the disadvantaged aren't expressed in public policy. So they're not able to voice their concerns about public policy in ways that change their experiences with public policy. And a set of scholars called policy feedback scholars have suggested that it's the structure of these public policies that contribute to this political inequality. So policies by design can shape whether and how folks or citizens, in my case, the marginalized, are expressing their political voice. So public policy can either undermine or build up beneficiaries' capacity to participate. Next slide. So Campbell notes in her 2012 paper that the design of public programs can shape the ability, interests, and opportunities of citizens to participate in political action. Etnext slide. But I'm arguing in this book, in part because of these surprising findings from my ethnography, I argue that social policies that target low-income families, they don't necessarily have to leave recipients feeling policed, distrusted, and alienated, but they can be designed to foster political and civic engagement. And it's important that we understand what could potentially go right in the design of programs as opposed to what usually goes wrong. Next slide. And here are some of the main takeaways from the study. There have been these major shifts in social policy since welfare reform. So instead of having a cash assistance program to support families, we've moved towards work supports, which are basically a set of social services that are designed to help low-income individuals find work and maintain work. And in addition to moving away from cash assistance to work support, we've gotten into decentralized social service delivery, which just basically means we're delivering most of the safety net through social services and primarily through now nonprofit social service providers. And in addition to these two trends, the work supports and social service delivery, we're now incorporating a lot of performance standards in service delivery. So in my case, I find that there are a set of performance standards that are encouraging positive relationships between bureaucrats and beneficiaries, that are encouraging recruitment and retention of families. And this is kind of counter to the prevalent narrative in a lot of social policy research that points to performance standards as producing negative encounters with the welfare state. And in addition to these work supports, social service delivery, and performance standards, there are also these policy guidelines built into this after-school care policy area that encourages empowering elements of program design. So there are guidelines that encourage after-school directors to involve parents through parent activities, through a parent advisory council, through volunteer opportunities, through employment opportunities. And finally, because of this decentralized service delivery, a lot of nonprofit organizations that are primarily place-based, they're empowered to design programs with community context in mind. So they're not sort of vacuums in the social service delivery context. They are developing unique identities that are responsive to community context and tailoring their services accordingly. And all of these conditions come together to create a state of empowerment for families. Next slide. So here are some components of this empowerment by design. So as I mentioned, there's empowering program design. So there are guidelines and these after-school policies that require staff to include parental involvement opportunities. And the political participation literature asserts that folks don't participate in politics in part because they lack the capacity to participate. And one way that people gain capacity to participate is through civic skill building, or building a set of skills that are relevant to political participation through a whole bunch of non-political organizations. So maybe you have a job that requires you to organize people, a job that requires you to write letters, to develop communication skills. Maybe you're involved in a community organization that requires you to organize and lead, or you're involved in your church and you're gaining civic skill building opportunities through that. Folks that are disengaged from the political process might not have those opportunities to get those civic skills. So the parent involvement requirements a lot of these after school policies create those opportunities. So it creates an empowering program design through parental involvement opportunities. And then there are empowering relationships. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the research on public assistance programs really emphasizes this contentious relationship between recipients and workers, where workers are sort of acting as a hostile gatekeeper to benefits, and they're rationing benefits to families that are proving that they're deserving of benefits. So there's this negative interaction typically that beneficiaries are having with bureaucrats, welfare bureaucrats. But I find in this empowerment perspective and the shift to more empowering program design, that there are ways to design programs that cultivate supportive or socially supportive relationships between staff and parents, where you're not acting as a gatekeeper. Staff are not acting as gatekeepers with families, but they're actually looking to recruit and retain families in programs. And that sort of shifts the way that they engage families. They're trying to attract folks as opposed to discouraging folks from participating in programs. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the importance of nonprofit organizations tailoring their approaches to communities that they serve, and developing these sort of unique organizational identities within communities. Next slide. So here's how this plays out in the data. So I chose 3 cases. Jackson, which is a public elementary school in Westfield. I'm using pseudonyms to describe these neighborhoods, which is an inner city community on the west side of Chicago. Then I have Progress, which is a nonprofit organization, a nonprofit faith-based organization located again in Westfield on the west side of Chicago. And then I choose South End, which is a nonprofit community center located on the south side of Chicago, as 3 cases. Now, I selected these cases because they varied in governance. So whether or not they were a form of direct governance or a public entity that's delivering policy, or a form of delegated governance where it's a nonprofit that's delivering policy. So in the case of Progress and South End, there are 2 nonprofits that are delivering after school care. And then I also selected them because they varied by the policies that sort of shaped the inner workings of the programs. So Jackson, as a public elementary school, they were governed by the Title I program and the policy guidelines within the Title I program. So Title I is educational policy that's targeting schools that have high poverty students with the objective of improving test scores and improving and enhancing academic achievement. A lot of schools receive Title I funding, and principals have discretion on whether or not they use that Title I funding to develop after school programs or supplementary supports for students. And then I chose Progress because it receives funding from the 21st Century Community Learning Center grant, which is one of the few federal funding sources for after school programs. And then South End received funding from the Child Care Subsidy, which is a federal program that supports child care from ages 0 to 13. Most of the childcare research focuses on early childhood education and how the childcare subsidy supports families with smaller children. 40% of folks that are receiving the childcare subsidy are actually using that money or that subsidy to support after-school care. So they're actually using it to support kids that are older that are in these after-school programs. So the study was really an opportunity to show how older kids or families with older kids are benefiting from the childcare subsidy as well. So I chose these different cases because they varied along the policies that they're subject to, and they're also subject to different sets of incentives too. So I talk about in the book at length the role of accountability and performance measures and standards and how that shapes the way staff engage parents. In Jackson in Progress, they had to report how well they were doing on indicators of retention and attendance. And at South End, they were responding to market competition and trying to attract parents because the child care subsidy program is a voucher-based program. Parents apply for the program. They either do or don't get it, and they take that voucher and they go find child care centers or after-school programs to use the voucher. And then we have program design. There's variation across the three organizations on how well they incorporated parents into service delivery. So Jackson, per the Title I guidelines, were required to offer parental advisory council opportunities. They were required to do parent meetings. Progress, per the 21st Century Community Learning Center guidelines, were required to have some sort of family engagement or parental involvement portion of program design. And that showed up in parent volunteer opportunities, parent advisory council opportunities, and in some instances, parent employment opportunities. And then South End, they didn't have a lot of parental involvement, in part because the child care subsidy didn't require it. So the standards and the guidelines that they were responding to did not include parental involvement as an indicator of quality. Next slide. So here's another explanation of the cases. So I've already kind of walked through what the guidelines looked like. I've walked through what accountability looked like and the types of governance that all three cases are kind of subject to. What I found really interesting and surprising was these organizational factors and really how these distinct programs understood the communities that they served and their particular role within the community. So even though all three organizations were serving very similar contexts, they each had distinct understandings of what those contexts were, the strengths and weaknesses of those contexts, and how the organization contributed to the neighborhood. So with Jackson Elementary, they really framed their role in the community and the role of the after-school program as this preventative stopgap. So Westfield was a hostile environment that pulled students into gang activity and into violence and into drug trafficking. And their role as an after-school program is to provide an alternative and to meet some of the material needs that students experience that motivate destructive lifestyles. So that was something that the staff emphasized a lot. We're providing an opportunity to show students that they don't have to be a product of their environment. In contrast, Progress Youth Development Corps, they really viewed themselves as a change catalyst and emphasized the potential of Westfield, this deteriorating community that experienced a lot of crime and a lot of hardship and economic divestment. They viewed it as a potential case for transformation and viewed the organization as bringing about this transformation or helping Westfield residents bring about transformation in the community. And then South End's Community Center described itself as a safe haven from the dangers of the South End neighborhood. So rather than viewing itself as an alternative to the crime and disorder in the community, it viewed itself as a way of protecting kids and families from the dangers of South End. South End wasn't a community that could be changed, and it wasn't in the organization's objectives to change the community. It was to provide safety and protection for children. And these unique identities really aligned with the scope of the programs and the scope of the service delivery. So with Jackson and South End, the program scope was pretty narrow. So Jackson focused on providing direct services to kids, meeting families' material needs. They had a food pantry. They had a mini laundromat for families that needed to wash clothes. They had a clothing closet for families. They really worked on providing those positive alternatives to neighborhood disorder and meeting material needs. South End really focused on providing safe recreational activities inside the center. So they made this distinction between what's outside and what's inside. And they worked on getting families inside and safe from the neighborhood. But Progress Youth Development Corps in contrast really had broader community-oriented forms of service delivery. So a lot of the activities they pursued were designed to improve the neighborhood. And they were a broader sort of community building elements of program design. So they did an outdoor basketball league. They did protests, marches. They worked directly with the aldermen to improve neighborhood conditions. Those were components of their service delivery, and it was much broader because they had this identity around change. They wanted to change the neighborhood, and they saw the neighborhood as something that could be changed. And in terms of the program design that parents experienced, in Jackson and Progress Youth Development Corps, because they were required to offer parental involvement roles, a select few of parents did get engaged in parent volunteer roles and in the parent leadership opportunities that are offered by the program. And they benefited quite a bit from those opportunities. They learned civic skills and were motivated through those opportunities to become more involved in their community and in local forms of political participation. Because the South End Community Center did not require parent involvement opportunities, they had more of a service-oriented interaction with parents where a lot of the interactions were basically cut and dry. Parent pickup, parent drop off is pretty straightforward. Parents aren't really asked to become super engaged in the program. And so parents really did miss out on those opportunities for civic skill building. At all three programs, which I think is a key insight if we're thinking about how we might take some of the features from these programs and apply them to other means-tested programs. At all three programs, the staff-parent relationships were pretty personal. So because the incentives were such that programs were encouraged to recruit and keep families in programs to make sure that there's high attendance, staff really worked to cultivate these positive, supportive relationships with parents. And in part because some of these programs, parents have long-term connections with, and they have these routine interactions with staff over months and years. And that sort of cultivated more social ties between staff and parents than what we would typically see in other public assistance programs. So parents are reporting positive personal interactions with staff members across all three. So what does this mean? Okay, we've got the policy differences and how that might shape those organizational factors and what people are actually experiencing in programs and how well the organizations are addressing the community that they're situated in. How does this matter for individual level outcomes? So the outcomes that I focused on were related to political participation and people's sense of efficacy. So whether or not they felt like the government, in this instance, local government, was responsive to them, that the local government cared about what they thought and was responsive to their concerns, and whether or not they felt like they had the capacity in terms of internal political efficacy, the capacity to change things, the capacity to engage in forms of political participation. And all of this is about the neighborhood. This is about place, because that's what was most salient to these parents. These parents weren't talking about Medicaid policy and recent changes to Medicaid policy. They were talking about the quality of community life and what options were available for them and their children within their neighborhoods. So the individual outcomes are about place-based political efficacy, capacity building. So whether or not parents felt like they had those civic skill building opportunities where they could effectively engage in other forms of political participation, and then actual place-based participation. So whether or not parents were engaging in local forms of political participation, which in this case was really about contacting elected officials and engaging in community work. So I find variation across these three programs on those outcomes. So for Jackson and South End, parents really did report lower place-based efficacy and almost a cynicism about the neighborhood and a cynicism about political processes. So I asked them, how does this organization, or how does what's going on in your community change the way you feel about your neighborhood? And their responses were primarily negative. And in the case of South End, a lot of parents said, well, the inactivity of this organization shows me that community organizations can't change this neighborhood. It makes me want to leave. So the organization and the program itself made them want to retreat and leave the community. And in for Jackson Elementary, there was a sense of hopelessness among parents about the state of the neighborhood and the inability of the school and the after-school program to do much. So those place-based efficacy feelings were pretty low for Jackson and South End. But for Progress, it was different. Progress parents, they commented on how much hope they had for the neighborhood and how the program itself had shifted the way they viewed the neighborhood and their capacity to contribute to community change. So that broader organizational identity of change catalyst and those broader community building services that the program offered really had a ripple effect on parents' understanding of the neighborhood and the prospect of transformation and their role in it. And then in terms of capacity building, so those civic skill building opportunities, there's some variation as well. At Jackson, I had some parents report that they had learned a lot of civic skills through the parental involvement roles that they had taken on. So through the local school council and through the parent advisory council for the after school program, parents reported learning communication skills and learning organizational skills, and reported using those skills in local forms of political participation like community work. With South End, because there were no parental involvement opportunities, parents didn't report having those skill building opportunities, and they didn't report having that connection to place-based participation. There wasn't an increase in place-based participation because there wasn't those skill building opportunities for parents. But for Progress, again, because there were these parental involvement opportunities, they reported a lot of capacity building as well. They reported, again, feeling strengthened in their communication skills, feeling like they had attained some leadership skills and organizational skills and working with people. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute, through the after school program. And then finally, place-based participation. So whether or not parents are engaging in local forms of political participation, that varied as well across the three programs. So for Jackson Elementary, I found that most parents were not engaged in local forms of participation. But again, for Progress Youth Development Corps, it kind of stands out in that quite a few parents had reported being involved. Not all parents, but quite a few had reported being involved in local forms of participation. Next slide. So here's a snapshot of parents' program experiences. So another thing to kind of consider when we're thinking about social policy research and people's encounters with the welfare state is there isn't one kind of encounter. And I think this policy case of subsidized school-age childcare shows that. So for parents, there was kind of a range of experiences. You had parents who were customers who basically picked their child up, had these sort of cursory, brief, child-centered conversations with staff, didn't really attend a whole bunch of program events, didn't really engage staff beyond that exchange. I'm dropping my child off, I'm picking my child up. These parents were customers. Parents who are customers tend to characterize their interactions with the program as cut and dry. Like that was the catchphrase that they tended to use. And then you have parents who were kind of friends. with staff members. So they'd come by and they'd shoot the breeze, and they would have these casual conversations with staff, and they might routinely extend their conversations with staff at the parent pickup. Or they might come to visit staff on their lunch break before or after program hours. And they really kind of developed a personal rapport with staff members where they're engaging in conversations beyond service delivery. And then you had active parents who were almost like staff within the program. So they took on staff-like roles and responsibilities. They would be manning the check-in table, the sign-out table. They'd be chaperones on trips. They would be organizing community events in the case of Progress, or they would be engaged in parent leadership roles. So they would be leading the Parent Advisory Council or leading a support group for parents. So these are sort of the range of program experiences that parents might encounter. And I think it's useful to think about the range of experiences that other folks might encounter with other forms of social services. Next slide. And as I highlighted a little earlier, this is sort of where parents fell. With Jackson, in terms of the individual participation outcomes, with Jackson, there was a doubt about social change, and parents expressed low political efficacy and moderate skill building opportunities. They had low involvement in place-based participation. With Progress, parents were hopeful about social change and expressed higher levels of political efficacy. They had a lot of skill building opportunities, high skill building opportunities, and were recruited into political activity through their relationships with staff. So they reported a lot of high involvement. And South End, there was a lot of doubt about social change and low political efficacy, minimal skill building, no recruitment into political action, and low involvement in local forms of political participation. Next slide. So here's an example. I've said a lot and I've worked through some tables, which might seem a little tedious, but here's some examples of place-based efficacy from the words of the parents. So this is Rebecca, who is a Progress mom. And this is her responding to how she views the organization is changing the way she sees her community. She says, I do a lot more work with kids in my neighborhood. In the summertime, I have a book club. So I go to the library, and whatever book I can find that's age appropriate, we'll all read the book together. We'll all talk about the book together. Most of the kids on the block call me mom. So it made me look at kids and the neighborhood and our surroundings in a totally different way. So this is her comments on how Progress has shifted her perspective on the neighborhood and motivated her to do neighborhood work, to do community work. Next slide. Here's an example of skill building opportunities. So this is Cheryl, who was a Progress parent who then became a program assistant. So she actually got a staff role over time at Progress. She says, I've learned to speak appropriately at different times when I'm speaking to somebody who could possibly, we could be linked together to do something better. And Cheryl also boasted about how her involvement with Progress had reshaped her reputation in the neighborhood as a change maker, as somebody who was going to be involved in making the neighborhood a better place. And then Rebecca comments on how her skill building opportunities have changed her. She says, I've learned how to instruct people and to do things. So if I had to teach anything now, I know how to approach that situation and teach different groups of people. So again, these are skill building opportunities that parents are getting through the parental involvement opportunities they have at Progress. Next slide. Here is a father who is talking about his recruitment into a local efforts to improve the neighborhood, in part to remove a speed bump and to get drugs off the street. These are his remarks about Progress. He says, they did good things for the neighborhood, and it feels good that I was a part of it. We were a part of putting the speed bump down. We were a part of getting the drugs off the street, getting the signs up, working with the police department. We had to go up there and talk to the alderman, call the alderman's office. We all worked together for it. So in Progress's efforts to be outward facing and to engage in these community building forms of service delivery, they invited parents into that process. They invited or recruited parents into political activity. Next slide. Progress also provided parents an opportunity participate in a roundtable with the mayor. So this is Rebecca commenting on that roundtable and how the roundtable gave her voice, gave her political voice. She said, during the teacher strike, they invited the mayor here to talk to the parents. And so we had a roundtable discussion with the mayor. It didn't go anywhere past the table. So she's expressing a little cynicism there. But, you know, they opened it up so that we had a place where we felt like we had a voice. So the after-school program coordinated a form of political participation, making those connections between an elected official and a citizen, and invited parents to engage in that activity. Next slide. Oh, thank you, which is great because there's some newer work that I wanted to talk about as well, but I'll let Mara get us going on the Q&A.
Thank you so much for sharing those key points. I love the lens to which you analyze and present these programs, and particularly your emphasis on how these programs and similar policies can shape as opposed to simply being a product of civic and political efficacy. One thing that really stood out to me, and I wanted to hear you elaborate a bit more about, was the role of inviting parents into the process. Mm-hmm. and how that took form in like very specific terms. Obviously, we know when we think of political engagement, resources matter, right? So, like having more money matters, but also having more time matters. And so I was wondering if you could say more about how these programs accounted for limited resources parents may have in terms of time, if that varied across programs, or, you know, when we think about how this might apply to other programs, if there was a way that program leaders invited parents without adding like another burdensome requirement. Right.
So one of the things that I asked when I interviewed these parents was about their willingness to participate. So did they participate in forms of civic and political engagement, why they did or didn't, and getting to the resources question and the capacity question. And a lot of parents really wanted to get involved, and they really wanted to get involved in their community. And they listed working with kids, working in the neighborhood as options, but it really hinged on the invite. So parents were looking for opportunities to get involved within the confines of their own limited time and resources. But if they weren't asked, they weren't involved. Because again, with these parents, they're largely excluded from the traditional non-political organizations that would be sources of political mobilization and that would do the asking. So they really relied on these service providers to offer the invite. So parents that were asked typically did participate and gave their time and how they saw fit based on their resource constraints. So the invitation is important. You have to ask.
So that it's not a requirement, but an opportunity.
Yeah. It's an opportunity.
I think that's I appreciate you highlighting that. We have, I want to jump into the extensions of this, but I want to incorporate this question that was raised by Catherine Treat Winslow. She talks about how you highlight how paternalistic and politically demobilizing government aid programs can be, and you highlight this alternative approach in the context of after-school programs. So she asks whether you think it could be applied or extended to other types of aid programs. Would parents be as interested in becoming involved if it was like opportunities to be involved, like at a health clinic or something of that nature?
So one of the extensions of this project was really directing me to other assistance programs that do have these distinct features. So in the past 6 years now, in the past 6 years, I've been doing work on WIC, which I think is a model program in how staff can develop supportive relationships with clients and how the program structures that. And there are some elements of this. There are some elements of these potentially empowering programs in the WIC program. So the routine interactions that recipients have with staff over time. With WIC, you can be on the program for up to 6 years, right? So, and you have an opportunity to get to know staff have an opportunity to get to know you. And there are opportunities to do, depending on the WIC clinic, there are opportunities to do support groups for new moms. There are opportunities for public awareness of issues that might be affecting new moms. So I think that it's happening in other programs. I think the challenge is, can policy scholars stay adept to the changes in the implementation, sometimes they outpace our capacity to track them, right? And to do good in-depth work on them. But it is happening in other programs, and these lessons can be applied. I've also done a lot of work on SNAP and Medicaid and bureaucratic encounters that folks have with those programs. And I've learned in my interviews with SNAP and Medicaid workers that they really do what they're incentivized to do. So if we incentivize supportive interactions with clients, if we incentivize workers as a part of a performance metrics to ask people about their family, as opposed to limiting conversation to eligibility, they would do it. If they knew it was tied to their job, they might do it. The problem is the incentives are such that they're discouraged to do those things. Like they're encouraged to process applications as quickly as possible and not engage in those personal, deeper conversations that might lead to social support or recruitment into other civic and political activities.
Thank you. I want to go to this other question that was raised by one of our students, Olivia Chang, and she asks about how, you did this research in Chicago. You explored the effects of government-funded after-school programs in Chicago, often in like relatively dense neighborhoods. So she asks whether you think the key components that you found to be really effective in these programs could be as effective in more rural or communities that are spread apart.
So I'm really thankful for that question, Olivia, because another extension of this project is a newer book project that I have about social service delivery in rural Southern communities, and sort of the distinct, unique features of rural communities that complicate how we understand policy implementation and people's experiences with the state. I do think that these insights can apply, in part because although rural communities tend to be expansive in terms of land mass, they're very insular and dense in terms of social networks. So strong ties and family ties matter quite a bit in rural communities. So we might actually see some interesting parallels when we think about the role of relationships in recruiting those who would otherwise be excluded from political participation into forms of civic and political engagement. So I think that that is worth noting. Just because it's rural doesn't mean it would be altogether different, in part because rural communities are pretty insular and everybody knows everybody, right? So that's sort of, when I ask people to describe their community in these rural counties here in North Carolina, that's one of the first things they say, oh, everybody knows everybody. So social ties matter quite a bit. I will say race factors in differently. I think in rural Southern communities, specifically in North Carolina, I can speak to that because that's what the book is about. I think that there are white power structures at work that, find their origins in the antebellum South and slaveholding that still perniciously affect the economic opportunities of low-income families in communities, low-income minority families in communities and rural communities, and the quality of service delivery. So there are these power structures at work that limit opportunities for families in rural Southern contexts that may not be at work in urban contexts. And we know that rural poverty is primarily, or poverty in general is primarily a Southern Black problem. So Southern Blacks are the poorest of all demographics. And we know that rural poverty tends to be a Southern problem. So why do we see these racial disparities in poverty and this concentration of poverty in the rural South? And I think it's because we have these legacies of slaveholding that impacts economic opportunities and social service delivery.
I want to hear you say more about this project that you're starting to mention. You collected this data that you presented in this book almost 10 years ago now, and obviously the world's changed a ton.
A lot.
Especially in these last few years. So I want to hear you say more about this book that you're working on now and how the takeaways from your last book, this 2020 book, and these cases you focused on in Chicago may be relevant to the state of the safety net today in ways in which you think they may be less relevant.
So yes, the data is old now, and so much has changed in the last year, year and a half, in terms of the safety net. I like tell my students, this is a watershed moment. I never thought this day this day would come when, the eligibility guidelines and intake processes for all of these major assistance programs like SNAP and WIC and Medicaid, that those things would be loosened up and made, these programs would be made more accessible to folks. So a lot has changed. As I mentioned, I'm working on a second book project that's under contract with Cambridge on race, the role of race in Southern rural communities and policy implementation. And we were doing the data collection for that last March, or I guess is it last March? March 2020. And we got the email that we had to come back to Durham and cease in-person activities. And we shifted to focusing on the COVID response. And we moved towards remote interviews or phone interviews with folks, with staff and people that were receiving these benefits. And we learned so much about bureaucratic capacity, about the importance of information or the learning cost of these policy changes. I have some slides. I don't know if maybe we can or can't put it up, but there are these major shifts in, oh yes, okay. So prior to COVID, we have all of these barriers to SNAP and WIC. We have the stress and stigma of engaging those programs and what's called compliance costs, which are basically the formal requirements you have to engage in to apply and successfully maintain benefits. So we had, people had long wait times. They didn't get reminders for appointments. They had negative interactions with workers. And it was hard to learn about, how to become eligible for these programs. And in the case of WIC, there were challenges in actually using WIC in stores. So this is like pre-COVID. Next slide. But then we have all of this amazing stuff that happened through the CARES Act that were designed to reduce these burdens and these sort of negative aspects of the program. So with WIC, you don't have to go in anymore. You could do your appointment over the phone. You could self-report all the stuff that they need to determine eligibility. And they made it more flexible to use your benefits in the store by changing which foods were eligible. You could swap out foods. And then with SNAP, you could do your appointment over the phone. You could self-report income, so you didn't have to submit the pay stubs, the extended certification deadlines, and all this stuff. And these changes, in theory, should have reduced administrative burden and expanded access. But next slide, when we asked people about how they experienced these policy changes, these COVID-related policy changes, we got a lot of interesting variation. So for WIC, and I have a paper out about this, WIC participants definitely loved the reduction in compliance costs. So they love the fact that they don't have to go in for their appointments. It's way more convenient. So 80% of our sample, and we sampled 200 people, we talked to 200 people, they reported positive evaluations with these remote appointments. But a bunch of folks, both SNAP and WIC participants, were totally unaware of all of these other program changes that were designed to make their lives easier in accessing and maintaining benefits. So only a third of the WIC participants we interviewed across the counties, we did interviews in about 6 to 8 counties, and only a third of them were aware that there were these food flexibilities. So they, reported benefiting from the remote appointments, but they didn't know it was actually easier to use their benefits in the store. So they're kind of going through the motions of, the challenges of using the benefits in the store, not knowing that the policy had changed to make it easier. And then with SNAP, folks were not aware of the online purchasing option. So that was something that was a policy change that happened alongside of the CARES Act that folks were totally unaware of. They learned about it through the interview. So a lot of people were learning about these reductions in administrative burden through the interviewer, which was kind of interesting. And they couldn't really take advantage of some of these COVID policy changes. We had folks that didn't know that their recertification deadline for SNAP had shifted. So they were still going through the motions of getting their pay stubs together and getting their recertification paperwork together, not realizing that they had another 6 months to do it. So it's a whole bunch of different stuff that was really revelatory, and the fact that some of the demand for these programs really outpaced bureaucratic capacity to deliver. So there are a whole bunch of families that just couldn't get through to a worker to apply for these benefits because workers were swamped and they had seen 30 to 40% uptick in applications and just sheer demand for programs. So that's what we've learned thus far, and we're still collecting data. We've expanded this study. I've expanded this study in collaboration with Jamila Mishner at Cornell to 2 other states. So we're really tracking to see the long-term effects of these policy changes and how this might affect people's connections to the state and how they evaluate the state.
That's so interesting. It must have been so interesting when you tell people about these changes to hear their like reaction in real time.
Yeah.
And their thoughts in real time.
So the title of, so I have a paper that's under review and the title is, I don't know nothing about that. Because that's what they kept saying. I don't know nothing about that. Tell me, why didn't she tell me about that? That would have been useful to know. Can you tell me how that works? So we were actually kind of playing the role of the worker in informing people about the policy change and how to take advantage of it.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
All right, let me go to this comment from Michelle Marin. She asks, how do you see these programs working alongside or perhaps in lieu of the federal child tax credit, basic living income, and other proposed quick cash policies? Well, so I think all of these are great. I'm so excited about these proposals and I'm excited about the child tax credit. I see, so one thing to remember is that relative to other developed countries, the US social safety net as it targets low-income families is super inaccessible and paltry in comparison. Like there are not a lot of supports for low-income families. So this is a huge improvement potentially by combining these socially supportive interactions that folks might have with their childcare providers with these more generous cash or tax credit kind of assistance programs. So I think, people tend to characterize the tax system as a form of the invisible or hidden safety net. And I characterize these childcare programs as a very visible, tangible form of the safety net where people are really having intense contact over time with workers. So I see positive experiences with the government, with the state through these hidden mechanisms, really boosting and benefiting and supporting what's happening in person with childcare providers. And we know from the psych literature and the family process literature that socially supportive relationships are good buffers for economic hardship. So as we improve people's economic situations and circumstances through more generous benefits, and we couple that with the socially supportive relationships that they're developing with these service-based childcare providers, we can see some really great stuff happening with families. Like I would love to get to the point where the story is no longer about how the state is stressing families out and disadvantaging kids to look at all these different components that are working together and these different mechanisms that are working together to improve parental efficacy or to improve parent-child interactions, to improve parenting practices, to improve measures of child development. Okay, that feeds nicely into another question from Janae Dill. And she asks, along these lines, how you see the state of welfare changing over the next 5 to 10 years, looking at, you're making these comparisons to other countries, especially countries that are just more generous in terms of their support systems. Do you see our country going in that direction? And then she asks a follow-up, if I can just throw that in too, about how President Biden's plan to enhance wages and working conditions among women of color, how that might narrow the wage gap. So I'm excited and hopeful about these changes and the proposed change to narrow the wage gap. This is all politics, though. So what I'm concerned about is a backlash of sorts against this progressive shift in the safety net. I mean, I've been teaching for the longest this pattern of retrenchment. So we slowly seen the erosion of safety net supports up until literally last year and the top of this year. So
it is a critical juncture and moment. We're in the middle of an unprecedented public health and economic crisis. So there's reasons why we see this major shift into something that's more expansive as opposed to a retrenching welfare state. But I worry that it's short-lived. So we'll see. Mm-hmm. We'll see how the political climate moving forward supports these shifts, or whether or not we might see a return to the status quo, because we're definitely not living in a normal moment. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. That's more of a political story, and how the two parties are going to look, what they're going to look like in 2 to 4 years. I think that'll determine whether or not we move towards an expansive safety net.
Yeah, it sounds like it makes me think of the whole thermostatic model, that we swing really hard one way into removing programs, and then we overcompensate the other way, and it just keeps going back and forth, more and more extreme. Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to ask perhaps one final question that ties it back to kind of the initial work that you did from Ashley Brown. And she wants to know how the pandemic impacted these after-school programs that seem to be kind of where you started a lot of this research. Mm-hmm.
So I'm actually working with a team out of Philly right now to figure that out. So there was a lot of funding that came out of the CARES Act that gave governors a ton of discretion on how they were going to support remote learning and support learning loss or reduce learning loss due to the pandemic. And a lot of that money went to after school programs. So right now we're in the process, because we're still in the middle of a pandemic, right? We're in the process of trying to figure out how programs have used that money and how the pandemic has shifted their functions, their key functions. So a lot of programs, they went from providing homework help to place to sleep, or a food pantry. Their functions fundamentally shifted in light of this crisis, or they became, daycare centers for families, younger kids and older kids, to provide work support for moms that had to go to work, moms who weren't, who were employed and were, essential workers. Sorry. A little bit of brain fog. So we're trying to examine that right now. There were a lot there. I guess I say all that to say there was a lot of funding that went to these programs, and we're trying to see how that might have shifted their core functions, and whether or not after school programs emerged as an even stronger or greater intermediary between vulnerable families and other state supports, and whether or not they were even more important in terms of the socially supportive elements that I talked about. Like, were parents really relying on after school programs for material assistance? Were they relying on after school staff for emotional support? We're examining that now.
Yeah, that makes me think of some of the programs that you also initially started looking at, that you had said they didn't start off as offering after school programs. Some of them started off doing something totally different, and they evolved to do that. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that a lot of these programs are evolving with community needs. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you think they can do with relative ease? Are there a lot of barriers to making those shifts?
So one of the arguments for nonprofit service delivery is that they're relatively nimble. And they're also often working on shoestring budgets. So there are creative ways that they show up, and ways that aren't as expensive as we think. So a lot of folks kind of point to, in terms of strengthening performance, they point to technology and software and administrative systems. But a lot of these, staff at these programs are just showing up for parents and families in very informal ways. So I imagine that in the same way that's been going on, it's probably increased since the pandemic. And these programs have become sort of focal points for communities in that way.
Well, that was a really amazing overview of your first book, of how it translates to your next book, in terms of how it ties in a lot of the different programs you're looking at, and how hopefully it makes people who are watching this think differently about how safety net programs can work. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. And I look forward to talking to you more in the future.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.